We are back with an update on the oil pressure sensor issue that we were having. We were not getting a reading on the gauge cluster. We were, on the last episode, able to do an ohm reading and then ascertain that we think that the sensor was working, and so now we're going to follow up with what we did after that. And so the first thing that we did was we borrowed an electronic oil pressure gauge and were able to wire it directly to the sensor. And Joel, tell us what happened after that.
Well, the gauge was designed for a different sending unit than the one installed in this vehicle, and so it was resulting in an unsatisfactory low oil pressure reading. It's reading about 25. So we knew we had pressure, the gauge came up, but that wasn't going to suffice for future use.
Yeah.
Yep. So we nixed that, and the next thing to do is to see whether or not that wire was in fact even talking to the gauge cluster. Somewhere in between there, we discovered some of the other gauges were not functioning correctly.
Yeah, so after we filmed this, actually, it was out on a shakedown run, and all the gauges decided that they would stop working properly. So we really thought we were looking at a failed gauge cluster, which is a common issue for the 88 to 98. But we got in there.
We got in there. We pulled the gauge cluster out. And again, using an ohm meter, we discovered that the ground connection for the gauge cluster was inconsistent at best and often non-existent. So we pulled the gauge cluster out and did a little bench testing on it to make sure that the gauge cluster itself was working by connecting it to 12 volts and all the gauges responded appropriately. The next thing we did was I made a jumper wire with a matching clip for the existing oil pressure sending unit. Looks like this guy here, and set the gauge cluster right here, wired it directly to the battery and the signal wire from the sending unit, and discovered upon starting the vehicle we had a healthy 50 psi of oil pressure on the gauge. So at that point we made sure we had established a solid ground to the gauge cluster and ran just a dedicated wire straight from the sending unit right to the back of the gauge cluster.
So what we ended up doing was putting a new wire in there, and the reason why we did that was when we were going to troubleshoot, try to find the wire coming out of there, it got completely lost in the main loom of the wiring harness, and it was just one of those that was like, we don't want to take out the entire harness to find this one. It's just a single wire going directly from the sensor to the gauge. We just ran a dedicated wire, so that was how we workshopped around it. We think that the problem is probably on our end, but we just couldn't find the wire in order to repair it, so we just replaced it and discontinued the use of it. But the good news now is that the gauge is working. All the gauges are working inside of the vehicle as they're supposed to, and we're moving forward on, we're getting a tune here in a couple days, and should be on its final shakedowns. We're going to get the AC charged, and this truck should be all put together for at least the medium term. Thanks for watching, and Joel, great job.
Thank you.